and thank you all for coming. I'm going to just share my screen with you. This picture in the title screen is from Anselm Kiefer's painting Tzimtzum, and that will be the concept that sort of lies in the background of the talk, the concept of Tzimtzum, or divine contraction. And this is perhaps the best known Kabbalistic concept, or at least the one that has been most used in various different ways. Here is a quotation from a work that I will speak about. It's from a book called Gate of Heaven by Abraham Cohen Herrera. And he says as follows: Ein Sof, the infinite, the first cause, when it wished to be communicated and produce the universe, it withdrew into itself, and as if contracting or shrinking, emptied a location or space out of the infinite spaces that it filled, in order to fill it with the effects that it produced, which it did while still remaining present in it as it had been before. Now, I find this a fascinating concept. I'm actually not going to say as much about the concept as I usually do. Much of my work is on concepts. I'm going to focus more on the personalities that helped to promulgate this idea. But I do think the idea itself is appealing, partly because of its paradoxical character. It is a way of thinking both divine immanence within the universe and divine transcendence at the same time, right? So the infinite somehow empties out a space for the production of something other than it, but also, as Herrera says, remains present in that space as it had been before. So again, much to say about that, but I'm not going to really focus so much on the concept this time, although I do think the appeal of the concept is part of the story. But I want to focus on some personalities. So first of all, just to say that this concept is familiar to and discussed by many philosophers in the 17th century. Henry Moore, on the left, from Cambridge, denounces the concept. Leibniz discusses it. Newton is clearly familiar with it. And this is something that I think needs to be accommodated within the history of European philosophy itself. It often is either neglected or it is featured as a mere curiosity. 100 years later, in the 18th century, the concept, along with other Kabbalistic ideas, plays a central role in the origin of German idealism, which is one of my areas of specialty. This is the frontispiece of a book by Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, Letters to Herr Moses Mendelssohn Concerning the Doctrine of Spinoza. This is the second edition of 1789. The first had been published 4 years earlier. So Mendelssohn had died. On the right-hand side, we have Mendelssohn and his friend Lessing, and on the left-hand side, Spinoza, with the symbol of infinity underneath. And Jacobi's argument in this book, among other things, is that Spinoza's views, which were considered extremely dangerous and scandalous, were almost equivalent to the ideas of the Kabbalah, and that these ideas together were the inevitable outcome of Enlightenment rationalism. So that Mendelssohn's dream of reconciling traditional religion with Enlightenment rationalism was doomed to failure. And I think I've argued in other works that German idealism originates there, but what had not really grabbed my attention until a few years ago was the discussion of Kabbalah, and in particular of Tzimtzum, or contraction. It comes up a few times in the conversation that Jacobi reports with Lessing. And the question is, how did they know about this? How did it become familiar? After all, these Kabbalistic ideas were made and developed within rather elite, closed circles of Kabbalists. They had manuscripts. They didn't even like to publish them, the original. So we'll see how they get translated and published in Latin, often before they were published in Hebrew and Aramaic. Here we have a little bit later Schelling and Hegel, two of the greatest German idealists who were deeply formed by Jacobi's book And both of them, in different ways, draw on this Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum, most famously Schelling, who talks about it in his some of his middle works, in particular at some length. Schelling knew enough about Kabbalah that he will use in his manuscripts the Aramaic terms, but only in the margins of the manuscript. When he actually publishes the work based on the manuscript, he will leave out the Aramaic terms. And for them, it is a central concept in their account of the finite as the self-negation of the infinite. Of course, in the 20th century, it's important, I think, to Buber's and Rosenzweig's philosophies of dialogue, but it's really Gershom Scholem, the great historian of Kabbalah, who brought our attention to this notion and made it really current among many philosophers and thinkers and writers and so on. In other work of mine, I've argued that Scholem's interpretation is extremely tendentious. It is what you might call a strong reading or a misreading of the tradition, and that's another talk, but he really has misled many people, I think. If he would have put forward his ideas as a theologian rather than a historian, I think that would have been more honest. And here from the movie The Life of Pi in 2012, you will notice the name of the boat, Tzimtzum. And nowadays one could even find in the bookstores not only the psychology of Tzimtzum, which is a very interesting work, but also popular books like The Tzimtzum of Love, A New Way of Understanding Marriage. So this has become a very common term. So what I want to address is, how did the Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum, developed in the closed circles of Kabbalists in Iberia and in the Galilee, mainly transcribed in tightly guarded Hebrew and Aramaic manuscripts, enter European philosophy in the 17th century? And I want to focus really on the personalities. And I think in order for this to happen, there had to be people who were boundary transgressors. This was a world in early modern Renaissance and early modern Europe of boundaries between the Christian world and the Islamic world, boundaries between Christians and Jews, boundaries between the parts of Europe where Jews could go and the parts where you could not practice Judaism openly without being subject to the Inquisition and to potential capital punishment. So it's important to recall that by 1600, there had been a great deal of movement. Basically, Western Europe by 1500 already, by the end of the expulsion from Iberia, from Portugal and Spain, by 1500, Jews in the open practicing sense are gone from Western Europe. And we have, of course, new settlements of Jews and new intellectual centers, especially to the east, in the north in Poland, and to the south in the Ottoman Empire. So we have many Jewish refugees. And one of the features of the refugee life is the question of one's culture, not only which material possessions you will take, if you can only take one suitcase, shall we say, but which works you will take, which concepts, and how you will preserve what you consider to be most valuable in your in the legacy that you inherit and that you want to take with you to your new place of refuge. And I think this is a big question for people at this time. And what we see is that eventually in the Ottoman Empire, a very small place, Safed or Tzfat in the Galilee, really became a center for two projects. Well, one is that it was the residence of Joseph Caro. I'm not going to talk about his work, but of course he had codified Jewish law, halakha, in the form of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. That is very much a project that arises from this refugee status. It had not been necessary in the same way to have a code. There was already a code from Maimonides. That deserves a different discussion. Also comes out of a crisis, at least according to Maimonides' preface, a crisis of transmission of Judaism under the Almohads and so on. In the case of Caro, we have the need for a kind of codification arising out of the expulsion from Iberia, and at the same time, a codification in the north, in Poland, by Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, who faced a similar situation. Local chains of transmission had been broken. But at the same time, in Tzfat, you also have Moses Cordovero, who in effect summarized, it's not quite a codification, but summarized the Kabbalah first of all in his youthful work, Pardes Rimonim, the Orchard of Pomegranates. It's a rather scholastic work, and it really tries to summarize the main ideas and concepts of the Kabbalah as it had been developed mostly in Iberia, but canonized in the form of the Zohar, the great product of Iberian Kabbalah. And there too, we have the appearance of Isaac Luria, known as the Ari, a strange and enigmatic and brief appearance. Cordovero died around in 1570, and Luria, who's still quite young, emerges suddenly as this leading figure. In 72, he dies. So there's a very short period of time during which he's teaching a group of people, a small, tightly knit group of people, most of whom must have already been students of Cordovero before. And for a brief time, less than 2 years, he teaches them. And those people then spend the rest of their lives trying to capture in various ways what they had learned from him. I think inevitably they drew on Cordovero's much more systematic and temporally extended teaching in order to fill out the rather ecstatic utterances of Luria, who himself said that he was too much of an ecstatic to write anything systematic. Nevertheless, Lurianic Kabbalah, which is not one thing, but a family of different extrapolations from Luria's teaching, spread throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and it really revolutionized Jewish practice. In the first place, Jewish practice, only in the second place, Jewish thought. But the legend of Luria of the Ari as a kind of mythic figure, as someone who had been taught by Elijah the prophet himself, and therefore whose utterances and practices took on a revelatory status that allowed them to override local custom, that spread much faster than the actual doctrines of Kabbalah themselves. So, but there was a great deal of curiosity precisely because of this legend. Now I want to go to 1596 and the raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz, led by Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, the favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, although like many favorites, of course, he would end up beheaded. So an Anglo-Dutch force raided the Spanish port. It took hostages. These days that would be called piracy, but apparently that was a perfectly acceptable form of state behavior in those days. Among the hostages was Alonso Núñez de Herrera. And we have a fascinating letter from Herrera. And I remember I began with a quotation from Herrera's Kabbalistic work, The Gate of Heaven. We have a fascinating letter to Essex, but ultimately to the Queen, saying he's not Spanish, he has no part in the conflict between England and Spain. He's in fact Italian, he's from Tuscany, and he's an agent of the King of Morocco. Now, Herrera was from a converso family. He was from a family with origins in Spain that lived openly as Catholics, but covertly as Jews. It's hard to know much about what Herrera himself was doing at the time. I remember that Spain is one of these places where open Jewish practice would lead you to great danger. It's possible that he is living, working in Spain as a Catholic. It's unknown, but he is a person who crosses boundaries, and there are many such people between the Christian world and the Jewish world. And this is very important to the spread of Kabbalah, because Herrera clearly has an education that for the most part only Christians would have access to. Unclear that what his education was. Did he go to university? I don't know. As we'll see, he interestingly did not write in Latin, although clearly read Latin, nor in Hebrew, which suggests that he wasn't completely comfortable with the academic languages. But nevertheless, he clearly read in those languages and was very well educated. And therefore, eventually, he's able to write books that are accessible to Christians, at least in terms of their content. So Herrera ends up in England as a hostage. The Queen sends a messenger to Morocco to try and find out from the king what the story is with Herrera. The messenger encounters plague and has to come back. It's a long story. Eventually, all the hostages get released. And it's just curious that Herrera is in England at the time, where also, at least by law, you were not allowed to practice Judaism. Although there were, we know, some Sephardi Jews who had some sort of covert practice. It's not clear that it was quite as hidden as it would have had to be, say, in Spain. Nevertheless, you couldn't openly practice Judaism until later on during Cromwell's period. So Herrera, we know about him from this 1596 raid and from the letter to the Queen. He then shows up later on in Amsterdam around 1620. Before that, we have some records that he was in Hamburg, and now in Amsterdam, he is living openly as a Jew. This is Rembrandt's picture of a synagogue. And of course, Amsterdam had become a refuge for Iberian conversos who wanted to live openly as Jews. They may have had business connections there already because of the earlier links between Amsterdam and the Habsburg Empire, but now with independence, it became possible under certain conditions to live there as a Jew and to be tolerated and so on. So he becomes a respected member of the Amsterdam Jewish community. And during that time, he writes a number of books. 3 of these books were in Spanish. Puerto del Cielo, Gate of Heaven, and that was in manuscript. This is a picture of one of the manuscripts. We have 4 manuscripts, I think 2 complete and 2 abridged. And that becomes the famous Kabbalistic work, which is best known. A second Kabbalistic work called Casa de la Divinidad, the House of Divinity. And then a book or 2 books on logic, which I think are really fascinating. There's a new edition of the Logic. It really needs closer study. He says in the introduction to the book that this will help people to understand his Kabbalistic works. And I think the connection between his understanding of logic and his understanding of Kabbalah has not yet been fully investigated. And that's something that I mean to do in my current book project. Now, the first 2 books were in manuscript. The third was published, although it doesn't have a date. The Kabbalistic book, however, he left money in his will to have these works translated into Hebrew. So one suspects that he wrote them in Spanish, which, as I say, was neither Latin nor Hebrew, neither of the more academic languages, because although he read Latin and Hebrew, probably didn't feel as comfortable writing in them. So the books were translated by Rabbi Isaac Aboab de Fonseca. Aboab was almost certainly a student of Herrera. He was the first leading rabbi in the Amsterdam Sephardi community to promulgate Kabbalistic ideas, new Kabbalistic ideas that came from the Galilee, that came from Sapir. Now, he also was the first rabbi in the Americas. He went to be the rabbi of the community in Recife, in what is now Brazil. But then after a few difficult years, the Portuguese conquered that territory, and the Jews had to leave, or else they would face the Inquisition. Some of them came up to New York and founded the Jewish community in New York. And the rest went back to Amsterdam, where they had come from, including Aboab himself. So I think when he goes back, I think he doesn't quite have his rabbinic position sorted out yet. Eventually he became really the rabbi of the whole community. But during that time, he took the money that had been left in Herrera's will, and he translated these 2 Kabbalistic works into Hebrew. And they were both published in 1655. Herrera had somehow and somewhere, well, at some point in time, met a very important student of Luria called Yisrael Sarug, probably around 1600 in Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik. We don't know anything else about what he was doing there. Presumably he was there on business. And Sarug had taught him the Kabbalistic ideas of Isaac Luria of the Ari. And Sarug is a very important figure who already in the 1590s had left the land of Israel, where he'd presumably been, and come to Italy and taught many people. He is said to have gone to Poland, to Frankfurt, and various places. He is not part of the sort of official transmission of Lurianic Kabbalah through Luria's disciple Chaim Vital. And for that reason, later on, Gershom Scholem said that he did not think that Sarug was authentically a student. He later retracted that a bit, but nevertheless, Sarug has not quite got the scholarly attention until recently that he deserved, because Sarug is the person who really spread Lurianic ideas in his own way throughout most of the Jewish world. At that time, Chaim Vital, who was the official disciple and successor to Luria, was famously guarding his manuscripts in a chest. There's a story that he became ill and some of them were stolen after a bribe was given to a servant and taken to Europe. But even when Vital's version of Lurianic Kabbalah gets to Europe, Sarug had been there first. And it can be shown that Vital's interpretation of Luria was received in a way that was shaped by Sarug's writings. So if you look at later Hasidic work and so on, Sarug's writings really shape the fundamentals, often more so than Vital. So Herrera is very much in the Sarugian tradition, and Abu Ab's book is abridged. It doesn't have all of the chapters of Herrera's, but Herrera, even in the Hebrew version, quotes many many more recent Christian theological works, and some of that is still visible even in Abu Ab's abridged Hebrew version. And one presumes that Abu Ab did not know as much about Neoplatonism and Christian theology as Herrera. Nevertheless, these are people from a converso background, and it's that boundary crossing that gave them access to Christian theology as well. I don't think I'm going to read all this out now, but this is the Spanish original of Herrera on Simtsum, on divine contraction, with an English translation. And a little bit later, this is the Hebrew and the Latin as well, which we'll get to. But I want to talk about how it came to be translated into Latin. So now that takes us to the middle of the 17th century, right? 1655 was when the Hebrew was published. Now, this is a period after the 30 Years' War. So now we go to Central Europe. The next figure that I want to introduce, sometimes called the Mad Duke, Christian August, the Count Palatine, and included in his territories is the small town of Sulzbach. So the 30 Years' War were, of course, some wars of religion. Of course, there were many other factors besides religion involved, but the region is divided between Protestants and Catholics, Lutherans and Calvinists, and so on. Christian August had not been able to go to the area that he had inherited until after the war. And then he goes there and he realizes, you know, it's split down the middle. He's got Catholics, he's got Protestants, he doesn't know what to do. He's also a deeply religious figure. And he has what looks like a nervous breakdown. He starts collapsing, fainting. He's really panicking. He doesn't know what to do. So what's interesting is who he summons. The person next to him on the right of the picture is Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont. Now, van Helmont was the son of the most famous physician in Europe, from Belgium, actually. But he was also the foremost Christian Kabbalist in Europe as well. He was deeply interested in Kabbalistic writings. And this is the person that Christian August summons to help him with this religiously divided territory. So van Helmont tells him, listen, this is what you should do. You should make all the churches available for Christian services of both kinds, Protestant and Catholic. You'll have a clock that determines when is the Protestant time, when is the Catholic time. You must invite the Jews to come and live in Sulzbach. They should have a community, a synagogue. They should have a Hebrew printing press, and they should also help you to educate your own family in Hebrew. So it's part of the rules of the community in Sulzbach that somebody has to be dispatched to the castle to help the count's children, wife, and so on, himself, learn Hebrew at a certain point in the day. And we can see that from the community records as well. Certain people were given exemptions from going to the daily service because at that time they had to go and teach Hebrew. So this becomes a really fascinating place. And at van Helmont's advice, Christian August hires a man called Christian Noor von Rosenroth. He was a very accomplished Hebraist. He had also studied with a rabbi in Frankfurt. and he becomes effectively the prime minister of this little area. But he also has, like Goethe and so on, later on, these people have time to do a lot of things, apparently. So he recruits a group of Christian assistants and some Jewish helpers as well on some pretty major projects. And there are three big projects, publishing projects, that they carried out in Sulzbach during this period of time. The first is an edition of the Zohar, that Kabbalistic classic. So of course that is in Aramaic. They also published an edition of the New Testament in Syriac and in such a way in Hebrew letters, so that someone who could read the Zohar could also read the New Testament, and someone who could read the New Testament could also read the Zohar. That is part of the project. The third book is the most important one for my purposes, Kabbalah denudata, Kabbalah laid bare. It's in 3 volumes, maybe 4, but it depends how they're bound together. And it's, between 2,000 and 3,000 pages. Most of it is translation. There are translated sections of the Zohar, those sections that are important for Lurianic Kabbalah in particular. Then there are Lurianic works. There are a few things by Cordovero. There is one commentary on part of the Zohar by Luria himself. Then there are there's a commentary by Vital, and there are several works by people influenced by Sarug. In particular, the 2 books by Herrera on Kabbalah, which had been written in Spanish and translated into Hebrew by Aboab, are now translated into Latin. And then there was commentary on all of this by Rosenrod himself. He also got Henry Moore from Cambridge involved. He thought Moore would be sympathetic. Actually, Moore didn't like this stuff very much. But then they have an argument in the book itself, which is fascinating. This picture is from the frontispiece, and you see the seeker after truth with the New Testament, the book of John on one side, and the Old Testament, the first pasuk of Bereshit, the first verse of Genesis on the other. Actually, it's cut off here on the slide, but at the top, the sun, you would see the Sfirot as well. The seeker of truth should have the New Testament and the Old Testament and be led by Kabbalah through the door. It's a fascinating work, and this was widely read. It came out in 1677 to 1684, at the exact same time as Spinoza's posthumous works, Spinoza's Ethics. And the 2 things were often read together throughout Europe. And it was felt that this was giving us some sense of Jewish thought, what Jewish thought is, both in its rationalist version and its Kabbalistic version. And this is the background to the letters of Jacobi that I mentioned and the conversations of Lessing that were sent to Mendelssohn. The idea that Jewish thought consisted of Kabbalah and Spinozism, and that one had to sort out the relationship between them. This is the beginning page within Kabbalah denudata of the translation of Aboab's translation of Herrera, right? So it's not the translation from the Spanish, it's a translation from the Hebrew translation. But because Herrera had a Christian education, and even in Aboab's version often mentions the Platonic tradition, the Neoplatonists, and more recent Christian theology, it's the most accessible work to a Christian reader. So of all the books that get cited, it seems to me, from Kabbalah denudata, there are 2 that get cited most. One is Herrera. The other one is Henry Moore's rather hostile summary of Kabbalah in a series of axioms, which I won't go into now. But of the sort of authentic Kabbalistic works that were translated, it's The Gate of Heaven, Shara Shemayim, Puerta del Cielo, that is most cited and discussed. Again, because it's in the most accessible form. There's a big question, I think, about the purpose of Rosenrod's publications. He sort of had to say in his preface to Kabbalah denudata that the goal of these translations was to convert the Jews. I mean, that was the justification that one had to give. However, if you look at what's going on in Sulzbach at the time, there is no effort whatsoever to convert the Jewish community. And conversely, critics of the project accused them of Judaizing Christianity. Van Helmont himself was captured by the Inquisition and taken to Italy. He was eventually freed when his aristocratic friends intervened on his behalf. But I think that this official purpose was not really genuine. Instead, what you see in Van Helmont's and Rosenroth's work is a very different picture. They have an idea of what we would now call Judeo-Christianity, a sort of common Kabbalistic framework, which could perhaps be read in two ways. It could be read in a Jewish way, or it could be read in a Christian way, and it would be a framework for religious harmony. And this is a very radical idea, so much so that they can rarely say it out loud, but Van Helmont is a very daring person. In Rosenroth's work, it's a little more careful, but I think that's clearly the framework that they're trying to promote. So this appealed to other boundary transgressors of the time. Most notable of these, for my purposes anyway tonight, is Lady Ann Conway. Ann Conway was a really significant philosopher, at least now she's recognized as one. Her work has been much neglected. Nowadays, you will find that Ann Conway's work is talked about a great deal by people who are working on early modern philosophy. There's almost a boom in Conway studies. So her brother went to Cambridge University. She was from a very distinguished family in England. And her brother was a student of Henry More, who I've mentioned a couple of times already. More was involved in the Kabbalah Denudata project. He was the sort of corresponding member of the group, if you like. So she became a student of Henry More, although she couldn't go to the university, of course, in those days, a student by correspondence. At the same time, she suffered from lifelong chronic pain. So a lot of her letters have to do with various remedies and cures that she is seeking. Henry More suggested that when Van Helmont came to England, as he did, he was also a physician like his father before him, and he had all kinds of experimental methods. Henry More suggested that Van Helmont should go and meet Conway and try and help her with her chronic pain. This did not succeed. What did succeed was Van Helmont's introduction of Conway to Kabbalah. And she became involved in Kabbalah. They both became Quakers, and this was a very scandalous thing at the time. Quakers were people who totally rejected the social hierarchy. And her home in Ragley Hall, which is probably what we see here, became a base for Quakerism, much to her husband's dislike, I have to say. And her book, The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, was published in Latin translation. She wrote it in English. It was published by Van Helmont and More in 1690. Now, we don't have the English original. Now there are English translations from the Latin. But what we do know is that it exerted a great deal of influence, especially on Leibniz, who describes his position as being very close to Conway's. Leibniz was also close to Van Helmont. In fact, when Van Helmont was dying, Leibniz ghost wrote Van Helmont's final book, which is not to say he agreed with it. The work that is most cited in the Principia is Herrera's Gates of Heaven from the Kabbalah Denudata. And she refers there to Tzimtzum as well. Now, I should say, I'm not going to talk about this, but the idea that mattered perhaps more than Tzimtzum to Conway is transmigration of souls, Gilgul HaNefesh. And that, I think, had a lot to do with her experience of pain and her understanding of suffering. Suffering made much more sense to her within a just world governed by a just God, if there could also be a transmigration of souls. And a lot of her book is devoted to that topic. Nevertheless, it's a very creative work that engages in an inventive way with the Kabbalah Denudata texts. And she endorses there, at least in passing, Van Helmont's vision of Kabbalah as a framework that could unite Protestant Catholics and Jews. And she says also Muslims eventually, although I don't think she says very much about how that would work. I'm going to stop there, and I'll just say that there's much more to be said about the concept of Tzimtzum, as I say, and why it attracted all these people. But my focus tonight has been just on the personalities and these fascinating people who made it possible for Tzimtzum to be discussed. Without Herrera and Abuab, who came from converso backgrounds, it seems unlikely that a Kabbalistic work would have been written that drew on and engaged in Neoplatonic and Christian theological discourse. And without, from the Christian side, people like Van Helmont and Christian August, who were also boundary transgressors in various ways with their deep interest in Kabbalistic thought, it seems impossible that those books would then have been translated into Latin, so that someone like Ann Conway, from her own remarkable background, would have ever encountered them at all. Now, there's a longer story to be told, which would bring us up to the end of the 18th century, how German idealism, as I mentioned, drew on these ideas in developing its metaphysics, a metaphysics that remains of vital interest in contemporary philosophy. But I'm not going to address that today. My focus has been on these remarkable boundary transgressing individuals who made it possible for these ideas to enter into general European philosophy. Thank you.